Hello, my name is Mia Hurd, and this is my psych case presentation on the movie Vertigo, which was directed in 1958 by Sir Alfred Hitchcock himself, king of suspense. Vertigo is a stunning psychological thriller film in which a detective takes up a job from an acquaintance investigating said man's wife, Madeline, as she's supposedly possessed by her ancestor. And this is made especially difficult by Ferguson's severe fear of heights that he developed from a traumatic case that caused the death of two innocent people. This era of suspense and psychological thriller encapsulates the entirety of the film and really sets up the idea of the diagnosis. Now, from a historical perspective, this is interesting because in San Francisco, 1958, post-war environment, there was this burgeoning idea of behavioral psychology first coming in, and this mental health stigma that potentially could have caused any hesitancy to get diagnosed, but Ferguson directly mentions going to see a psychologist and getting diagnosed with acrophobia himself in the film, as of those sanatoriums where people with mental disorders were taken. And so it's this interesting juxtaposition between this hesitancy to receive adequate medical help as it is first coming into play within the scene. I am going to diagnose Ferguson directly with acrophobia, with this underlying leaning towards PTSD, but I'm going to be focusing mainly on acrophobia as it is the entire cornerstone of the movie, and it is explicitly mentioned 6 minutes into the film. Acrophobia is a fear of heights, and it is an anxiety disorder in which you are just completely terrified and faced with anxiety from witnessing any heights. Culturally, acrophobia is one of the most commonly well-known and had fears in the entire world. But you may or may not be less or more likely to be diagnosed depending on your exposure to heights and the social atmosphere around heights, depending on where you live. However, I could argue that because Ferguson's acrophobia develops because of his processing of a traumatic incident in his past, and because they share symptoms, that he also has a bit of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, two symptoms that Ferguson has are vertigo, which is this dizziness of motion, and also lightheadedness, shortness of breath, and panic attacks. As such, on the right you will see listed timestamps relating to when he mentions having a racing heart, tingling sensation, and also the clock tower incident in which we see the camera's cinematography actually distort and shake as a representation of his perspective in the moment. Also, as a reference to PTSD, the night tremors and terrors that he faces, as well as resulting catatonia, are symptoms of facing a traumatic event, which could lean into it, but mainly for the acrophobia, his idea of panic when facing these is explicitly seen on screen. The weakest evidence for this is the quote-unquote disproportionate fear, because he is cynical about his own diagnosis, and he really explains it's more biological, as he wants to decrease it, but also because of this connection to PTSD, it could be argued that, in fact, acrophobia is less of a player here, and it's really more of his reaction to the event from the height that is causing these symptoms. Now, for treatment, the three most common are cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, and SSRIs. However, because the drug was not actually invented until 1989 or so, I'm only going to be looking at this diagnosis from a historical perspective and seeing what Ferguson himself could actually be given within the universe. Cognitive behavioral therapy has no ethical concerns because he is merely seeing a psychologist and trying to break down the fear, especially with the climax of the film. The most he'd be facing is emotional trauma. One barrier to this would be societal trepidation, as mentioned at the beginning, where he could be hesitant to receive help because of this obstinate. Now, exposure therapy is something that he could even self-practice, and he does in the film in the first 10 minutes or so. He gets on this step stool to demonstrate this idea of systematically desensitizing him to heights as the film progresses, in which he could eventually get over his fears by seeing from higher and higher. From a broader perspective, Vertigo showcases a generally accurate portrayal of acrophobia and an underlying glimpse as to what traumatic experiences can induce because of this reference to PTSD, but also especially because acrophobia, it may not be entirely accurate, as at the end of the film he quote-unquote maybe cures his acrophobia from witnessing a death, but because the film is supposed to really more so reflect this idea of reality, especially in the cinematography of the clock tower scene, it shows how Hitchcock is able to show this perspective of acrophobia and the vertigo that Ferguson shows without actually the portrayal of acrophobia in the film influences our understanding of the disorder by showcasing cinematographically how actually it can impact him as an individual. It reflects his reality, such as through the shaking and the trauma and the treatments that he undergoes.